Somewhere in your home right now, there is probably a piece of paper that proves you are real. It might be in a drawer, it might be in a fireproof box, or a folder labeled important documents, or stuffed in the back of a filing cabinet you haven't opened in years. It's a little water-stained maybe. The ink is a strange color. There's an official seal pressed into it, and a signature, and a date. And that single sheet of paper is, in a very literal sense, the foundation of your entire legal existence. Without it, you can't get a passport, you can't get a social security number, you can't enroll in school, get a driver's license, board an airplane, claim a pension, or, in many places, register to vote. Everything you are in the eyes of the state grows out of that one document. Your birth certificate, we treat it like it's timeless, like it's always been there, like every human being who ever lived in America must have had one waiting for them the moment they took their first breath. But here's the thing that almost nobody knows. For most of this country's history, that document did not exist. There was no birth certificate. There was no standardized system to record that you had been born. For well over a century after the founding, a person could come into the world, grow up, marry, raise children, work an entire lifetime, and die without the federal government ever creating a single official record confirming that they had existed at all. And that raises a question that is genuinely stranger the longer you sit with it. If there was no birth certificate, then how did the government know you existed? How did anyone prove who they were, or how old they were, or where they came from? How did a nation that would eventually become the most heavily documented society on Earth function for over 100 years, when the most basic record of a human life simply wasn't kept? The answer takes us through colonial church registers and family Bibles, through tax collectors and militia musters, through a progressive era obsession with counting, through child labor factories, through one of the darkest chapters of American racism, and finally into a debate that is raging in this country right now today over who counts as a citizen and what it takes to prove it. Because the story of the American birth certificate is not really a story about paperwork. It's a story about power. It's a story about who gets to decide that you are real. And once you understand how recently we handed that power over, you will never look at that stained little piece of paper in your drawer the same way again. Let me take you back to the beginning. When European settlers arrived on the shores of North America in the early 1600s, they brought their record-keeping habits with them. And in the world they came from, keeping track of births was not the government's job. It was the church's job. For centuries in Europe, the institution that recorded the milestones of a human life was the parish. When a child was born, it was baptized, and the priest wrote the baptism into the church register, along with the child's name and its parents' names. When two people married, the church recorded it. When someone died and was buried, the church recorded that too. These registers were the closest thing the world had to vital records, and they existed to serve a spiritual purpose, not a bureaucratic one. The state didn't need to know when you were born. God's representative on earth did. The colonists carried this straight across the Atlantic. In New England, some town clerks began keeping their own informal notes on who was born and who died. But the practice was scattered and inconsistent, and enormous numbers of people slipped through entirely. Elsewhere, the church registers remain the main record, where they were kept at all. Now, a few colonial governments actually did try to force the issue. As early as 1632, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law ordering ministers to report every christening, every marriage, and every burial to the authorities each year. It was one of the earliest attempts in the New World to make the recording of human life a civic duty rather than a religious one, and it collapsed almost immediately. The idea was so foreign to the way church officials operated that the law was effectively ignored. A few years later, in 1639, the Massachusetts Bay Colony went a step further and ordered town officials, not just churches, to record all births and deaths. Connecticut followed in 1641. New York picked up the practice after the English took over in the 1660s. Virginia tried again near the end of the century. And here is the crucial part. Almost none of it worked. The laws were on the books, but enforcement was a fantasy. Compliance was spotty at best. There was no mechanism to gather the scattered local records into anything resembling a coherent whole, and there was no penalty meaningful enough to make anyone care. Part of the problem was the sheer physical reality of life in early America. Women gave birth at home or in a neighbor's home attended by a midwife, far from any clerk's office. Infant mortality was staggering. A huge number of children died before they were old enough to be baptized, let alone recorded. Families moved. Frontier settlements had no clerk at all. And enslaved people, who by the 18th century numbered in the hundreds of thousands, were deliberately excluded from most forms of recognition entirely, treated in the ledgers as property rather than persons. So the paper trail for an ordinary American life in those first 2 centuries was thin to the point of transparency. And this leads to something that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. Most people did not know their own birthday. I want you to really absorb that because it sounds absurd to modern ears. But it's true. In a world without birth records, age was not a hard fact printed on a card in your wallet. It was a fuzzy, approximate, negotiable thing. When the census takers of 1900 went door to door asking people how old they were, they found enormous numbers of Americans who simply could not answer with any precision. People guessed. They rounded to the nearest 10. They remembered being born around the time of the Big Flood, or the year the church burned. Age awareness, the very idea of knowing exactly how many years you had been alive, spread slowly and unevenly across the country. And for a great many people, it never fully arrived at all. So if you couldn't prove your age, and there was no document confirming your birth, how on earth did the machinery of society function? How did anyone decide whether you were old enough to marry or vote or serve in the militia or be tried as an adult for a crime? The answer is that age and identity itself was a matter of negotiation with authority. When you needed to establish how old you were, you testified. You stated your age, and the official looked you up and down and decided whether to believe you. A militia captain sizing up a young man, a court clerk assessing a witness, a minister about to marry a young couple, a tax assessor deciding whether you owed the poll tax. All of these officials had to guess at people's ages constantly, and they did it by looking at faces, at hands, at bearing, and by asking neighbors who had known you your whole life. If you had no written proof, you were vulnerable. Someone with power could simply assign you an age, and you'd have little way to argue. Identity, in other words, lived in the community and in memory. It was oral. It was social. Your neighbors knew who you were and roughly how old you were, and that collective knowledge was the record. There was no card to produce because there was no card. But wait, you might be thinking, governments have always kept track of people. What about the census? What about taxes? Surely the state knew who its people were. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating because the answer is yes and no. The government watched its population intensely, but it watched for very specific reasons. And those reasons had almost nothing to do with recording that you, as an individual human being, existed. Since the dawn of organized states, rulers have counted their people for 2 purposes above all others: taxes and soldiers, money and manpower. Ancient Rome ran censuses to determine who could be taxed and who could be conscripted. The word census itself comes from the Roman office responsible for exactly that. And when colonial and early American governments looked at their populations, they were looking through the same lens. They didn't care that a baby had been born. They cared about who could pay and who could fight. So the records they actually kept tell you everything about what the state valued. There were tax rolls listing the people known as tithables or taxables, typically men above a certain age who owed money to the colony. There were militia rolls and muster lists recording the men of fighting age who could be called up to defend the settlement. There were poll lists of who could vote and freemen lists of who had been granted the legal status to trade or hold property in a town. These are the documents where colonial Americans appear. But notice what that means. You showed up in the government's eyes at the exact moment you became useful to it, and you vanished the moment you weren't. A boy did not exist to the tax collector until he turned 16 and became a tithable. A woman, in most contexts, barely appeared in these records at all, because she was neither taxed as a head of household nor eligible for the militia. The poor, the very young, the very old, and the enslaved were largely invisible to this system, not by accident, but by design. As one historian put it, that's not a gap in the record keeping. That's the record keeping doing exactly what it was built to do. And even the great national headcount, the census, mandated by the Constitution itself and first conducted in 1790, was not what we imagine. Its purpose was to divide up seats in Congress among the states, so it was really just a tally of numbers. For the first 60 years, the census didn't even bother to write down the names of most people in a household. It recorded the head of the family, and then it counted everyone else as tick marks in columns, sorted by age bracket, by sex, by whether they were free or enslaved. You were a hash mark. You were a number in a box. It wasn't until 1850 that the census finally started recording every free person by name. Put all of this together and you arrive at a truly strange picture. A person in early America could be born, live a full life, and die, and generate almost no personal government record of their existence as an individual. They might appear as an anonymous tick mark in a census column, as a name on a tax list once they were old enough to owe money, as a militiaman if they were the right age and sex, and as an entry in a church register if the local minister happened to be diligent. And that was it. There was no cradle to grave file, there was no identity number, there was no certificate proving you had entered the world. For most of American history, the government didn't know you existed in the way we mean it today. It knew you as a taxpayer, a soldier, a voter, a statistic, but it did not know you as you. And for a very long time, nobody thought there was anything strange about that at all. So what changed? What turned a nation that could barely be bothered to write down its own births into one where you cannot function without a certificate of yours? The answer begins with a flood of people, a wave of reformers, and an almost religious new faith in the power of counting. In the second half of the 19th century, America transformed with terrifying speed. It went from a rural, agricultural nation of scattered farms and small towns into an urban, industrial powerhouse of smokestacks and tenements and railroads. And the fuel for that transformation was people. Between roughly 1815 and 1915, some 30 million Europeans poured across the Atlantic and into the United States. They packed into the cities. They crowded into neighborhoods that swelled far faster than anyone could build sewers or schools or hospitals to serve them. For the reformers of the era, the people we now call the progressives, this created a crisis and an obsession all at once. The cities were overwhelmed, disease was spreading, working conditions were brutal, and children were dying in numbers that shocked the conscience of the growing middle class. And these reformers, many of them well-off women who threw themselves into the problems of the tenements, came to believe that the solution to chaos was information. If you could measure a problem, you could manage it. If you could count the sick and the dead, you could fight the epidemics. If you could count the poor, you could plan the relief. Data was power, and power was the ability to fix things. So America entered what you might call the age of counting. Reformers mapped neighborhoods by ethnicity. They compiled lists of the unemployed. They surveyed housing conditions. And when it came to public health, they ran headlong into an infuriating wall. To fight disease, you needed to know how many people were being born and how many were dying and where and of what. You needed vital statistics. And America, unlike the modern nations of Europe, barely had any. This was a genuine national embarrassment. Britain had built a centralized system to register births, marriages, and deaths starting in the 1830s. Other European countries had followed. These nations could tell you, with real precision, how many children were born in a given year and how many mothers died in childbirth. America could not. The information simply didn't exist in any usable form because it was scattered across thousands of local jurisdictions that recorded things differently or didn't record them at all. And so the reformers began to pressure the federal government to fix it. They wanted the nation to start systematically registering every birth and every death using a standard form gathered into a coherent national picture. What they were demanding, though they wouldn't have phrased it this way, was the birth of what scholars now call the information state. A government that no longer knew its people vaguely and communally through the memory of neighbors and the approximate testimony of individuals, but knew them precisely, individually, and on paper. A government where written documents produced by professionals, would replace the oral and the transient, where a certificate would outrank a memory. Around 1900, the machinery started to turn. The federal government established what were called registration areas, beginning with deaths. A state or city could join the death registration area if it could show that it was actually recording a high enough percentage of the deaths happening within its borders. It was a clever design. Rather than forcing states to comply, which the federal government had no clear constitutional power to do, it created a club that states could earn their way into and then pressured them to raise their standards to qualify. But the pieces were still loose, temporary, and improvised. What the whole project needed was a permanent institution to drive it, a machine that wouldn't get dismantled every 10 years. And in 1902, America built exactly that. For its entire history up to this point, the United States had treated the census as a temporary event. Every 10 years, the Constitution required a head count, so the government would spin up a temporary office, hire an army of census takers, count the nation, tabulate the results, and then shut the whole thing down again until the next decade rolled around. There was no permanent statistical agency. There was no standing body of experts whose job was to know the American population. Then, on March 6, 1902, Congress passed an act with a boring name and enormous consequences, an act to provide for a permanent census office. It did exactly what it said. It took the temporary, on-again, off-again census operation and made it permanent, a standing federal agency that would never again be shut down between counts. The new Permanent Bureau opened its doors that summer on July 1st, 1902, in a building in Washington under the leadership of a director named William Rush Merriam during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Within a couple of years, it would move into the Department of Commerce and Labor and take the name we know it by today, the Bureau of the Census. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a dry piece of government reorganization, but buried inside it was something transformative. The Permanent Census Bureau was given the authority to collect information on births and deaths, to develop the birth registration areas, and to build a standard national system of registration. For the first time, there was a permanent federal institution whose ongoing job included the task of knowing when Americans were being born. This is why, when people say America had no birth certificate until 1902, that year is the answer. It's not that no birth record of any kind had ever existed before then. Some states and cities had been recording births for decades. It's that 1902 is the moment the permanent national machinery was switched on. The moment the country committed to building a standardized system to document the birth of every American, coordinated from the center, running continuously, forever. Before 1902, birth registration in America was a patchwork of local ledgers, church books, and family Bibles, wildly inconsistent from one town to the next. After 1902, there was a permanent federal engine dedicated to turning that patchwork into a uniform national record. In 1907, the Bureau took the next logical step and produced a model law and a standard certificate of birth, a template that states could adopt so that a birth recorded in Maine would look like a birth recorded in Oregon. And this points to a peculiarity of the American system that survives to this very day. The federal government never actually took over the recording of births. It coordinated, it cajoled, it set standards and offered templates and created clubs to join, but the actual birth certificates were, and still are, issued by the states, not by Washington. There is no single national birth registry in the United States. Your birth certificate was issued by the state where you were born, which is why they can look completely different depending on where you came into the world, and why the federal government, to this day, does not maintain a central file of everyone's birth. Even now, the Census Bureau will tell you plainly that it does not issue or keep your birth certificate. That's your state's job. So the machine had been built. But building a machine and getting a whole nation to use it are two very different things. The Permanent Census Bureau could design the perfect standard certificate, but it couldn't force a midwife in rural Appalachia or a county clerk in the Deep South to actually fill one out and file it. For that, the birth certificate needed something more powerful than a bureaucrat's request. It needed a reason. It needed to suddenly matter to ordinary people and to the officials who govern them. And the thing that gave the birth certificate its teeth, the force that finally began to drag American births onto official paper, was not public health, and it was not the census. It was a fight over children working in factories. At the turn of the 20th century, child labor was everywhere, and it was brutal. In 1900, roughly 1.75 million American children between the ages of 10 and 14 were working for wages. They worked in textile mills and coal mines and canneries and glass factories. They worked 10-hour days, sometimes longer, in conditions that maimed and killed. Before the 1890s, many states let children labor up to 60 hours a week, and a growing movement of reformers was determined to stop it, to pull children out of the factories and put them into schoolrooms. But when they tried to write and enforce laws banning children under a certain age from working, they slammed into a wall that will sound very familiar by now. How do you prove a child is too young to work when there is no record of when that child was born? This was the whole problem in miniature. A factory owner, hauled up for employing an underage worker, could simply shrug and say the boy looked plenty old enough, and who was to say otherwise? The child's age was, as always, a matter of testimony and appearance. And crucially, the people who had traditionally vouched for a child's age were the child's own parents. But in the world of child labor, the parents were often the last people you could trust to tell the truth. Working-class families depended on their children's wages to survive. The household economy assumed everyone contributed. So when a truant officer or a factory inspector asked how old a child was, the family had every incentive to lie, to swear the boy was 14 when he was 11 because the family needed the money he brought home. The reformers realized that the entire system of age verification had to be taken out of the hands of parents and communities and handed to the state. They needed a form of proof that didn't depend on anyone's word, a document produced by a neutral professional at the moment of birth that fixed a child's age as an objective fact, independent of what any parent might later claim. In 1903, New York passed a labor law that pushed toward exactly this, and it became a model that reformers carried from state to state. There's a historian named Susan Pearson who has written the definitive account of this, and she captures the profound shift at the heart of it. The solution to enforcing child labor laws, she argues, was to move the authority to authenticate a child's birth away from the very people who had actually witnessed it, the parents, and give it to the state. A professionally produced birth certificate turned a child's age into something that existed apart from the human relationships that created that child. Your birthday stopped being a thing your mother remembered and became a thing the government certified. And in doing so, the birth certificate quietly became the threshold document of modern citizenship, the thing you needed to produce before the state would recognize your claim to protection, to schooling, to rights. The pressure worked slowly, unevenly, but relentlessly. States began to take birth registration seriously. In 1915, the federal government formalized the birth registration area, the birth counterpart to the death registration club it had created years earlier. And the entry requirement was demanding. A state could only join if it could prove that at least 90% of the births within its borders were actually being officially recorded. That 90% threshold turned out to be brutally hard to hit, and it exposed exactly where America's blind spots were. In the industrial, bureaucratic North, with its established public health offices, states integrated fairly quickly. But in rural regions, in impoverished areas, in the South, where most babies were still born at home and delivered by midwives who had never filed a form in their lives, the number of unrecorded births stayed stubbornly high. County clerks were underfunded and unmotivated. Physicians and midwives forgot, or didn't bother, or didn't know they were supposed to. And so it took years, decades even, for the map to fill in. It was not until 1933, more than 3 decades after the permanent Census Bureau was created, that the last state finally qualified, and every state in the Union was, at last, registering births to an acceptable standard and reporting them into the national system. 1933. That is astonishingly recent. It means that if you were born in the United States before 1933, whether an official birth certificate exists for you at all depends entirely on which state you were born in and how diligent the local clerk or midwife happened to be. Millions of Americans alive in the 20th century had no birth certificate because when they were born, the system hadn't reached them yet. But as the birth certificate spread, it revealed a second face. Because a document powerful enough to prove that you exist and to fix who you are is also a document powerful enough to be turned against you. And in one American state, a single man showed the world just how dark that power could become. Everything we've discussed so far paints the birth certificate as a tool of inclusion, a way of granting people protection and recognition. But the birth certificate did not only record that you existed, it recorded what you were. And in the early 20th century, one of the things American birth certificates were made to record was race. To understand how sinister that could be, you have to meet a man named Walter Plecker. In 1912, the state of Virginia created its Bureau of Vital Statistics, the office responsible for recording every birth, marriage, and death in the Commonwealth. And it appointed Plecker, a physician, as its very first registrar. He would hold that post for 34 years. In his early years, some of what he did was genuinely beneficial public health work. He pushed to register births properly, supervised midwives to improve sanitary conditions, and helped bring down infant mortality. But Walter Plecker was also a committed white supremacist and a fervent believer in eugenics, the pseudo-scientific movement that dressed up racism in the language of biology and claimed that society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce, and with whom. In 1924, Plecker got his masterpiece written into law. Working with a white supremacist organization he helped lead, he championed and helped draft Virginia's Racial Integrity Act. The law did something chillingly bureaucratic. It required that the race of every single person be recorded, and it recognized only two categories: white and colored. It defined a white person as someone with no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, and it made marriage between white and non-white people a crime. And the instrument for enforcing all of this was the vital record system that Plecker controlled. Every birth certificate, every marriage license now carried a racial label, and Plecker sat at the center of the machine, personally policing what those labels said. He used that position to wage a campaign of erasure, and its primary victims were Virginia's Native Americans. Plecker had decided, on the basis of his own prejudice, that no real Virginia Indians remained, that the people claiming that identity were actually of mixed African ancestry, trying to escape the colored label. So he set out to make that belief true on paper. He went through birth records and reclassified Native people as colored. He instructed local registrars and clerks that certain family names must be treated as colored no matter what those families said about themselves. If a document listed someone as Indian, Plecker would strike it through and change it. He compiled lists of surnames to hunt down. Tribal members would later give what he did its unforgettable and precise name: paper genocide. Not the killing of bodies, but the erasure of a people's identity from the records that the modern state now used to define who they were. And because Native identity had been scrubbed from the birth certificates, the marriage licenses, the death certificates, and the deeds, generations of Virginia Indians would later struggle to prove their own heritage, and their tribes would face enormous obstacles winning legal recognition, obstacles that echo to this day. Plecker's cruelty was personal. In 1924, a new mother in Virginia received a letter from his office informing her, in cold and devastating terms, that her baby could not be counted as white, that the child could never attend white schools or marry a white person in Virginia, and that this was, in his own chilling phrase, an awful thing. He wrote thousands of letters like this, hectoring county clerks who didn't enforce his classification strictly enough, harassing families whose ancestry he had decided to challenge. And the law he built contained a detail that exposed the whole thing as a fraud. The Racial Integrity Act included what became known as the Pocahontas exception. The problem was that some of Virginia's most prominent and powerful white families proudly traced their lineage back to Pocahontas, the famous 17th century native woman who married the colonist John Rolfe. Under Plecker's own one-drop logic, those blue-blooded families would have been reclassified as colored. So the legislators simply carved out an exception, allowing a small trace of native ancestry to still count as white, specifically to protect the elite. It laid the whole scheme bare. This was never consistent biological science. It was a political weapon bent and shaped to protect the powerful and crush the vulnerable. Virginia was not alone. In New Orleans, a registrar named Naomi Drake spent years in the mid-20th century doing something disturbingly similar, scrutinizing birth certificates for names she associated with black families, reclassifying people as black if she suspected any African ancestry, and refusing to release documents to people who wouldn't accept her ruling on their race. The Racial Integrity Act stayed in force for over 40 years. It was not struck down until 1967 when the United States Supreme Court, in the landmark case of Loving versus Virginia, ruled that laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional. Virginia did not formally repeal the act and its related racist statutes until 2020. The lesson of Walter Plecker is one that should never leave you as you think about that document in your drawer. The same certificate that grants you recognition can be used to define you against your will. Whoever controls the record controls the identity. To be counted is to be seen, and being seen by the state is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a cage. For all the reformers' efforts through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the birth certificate was still, for most ordinary Americans, a somewhat abstract thing. It was a public health statistic, a tool for the government and the reformers, not something the average person carried in their pocket or thought about in daily life. Plenty of adults had no birth certificate and had never once needed one. Then, in 1935, that changed almost overnight because of a single law. The Social Security Act, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in August of 1935 in the depths of the Great Depression, created a system of old age benefits for American workers. And it contained a requirement that suddenly made a birth certificate one of the most valuable pieces of paper an ordinary person could possess. To claim your benefits, you had to prove that you were old enough to receive them. You had to prove your age, and millions upon millions of Americans could not. Think about who was reaching old age in the late 1930s and 1940s. These were people born in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, born decades before the birth registration system existed, born in an era of family Bibles and church registers and neighborly memory. They had no birth certificates because birth certificates hadn't existed when they were born. And now the federal government was telling them that to get the pension they had earned, they had to produce documentary proof of a birth that had never been documented. The result was a nationwide scramble that historians call the era of the delayed birth certificate. States created procedures to issue a birth record long after the fact, sometimes 50 or 60 years after the fact, for people whose births had never been recorded. And to get one, you had to assemble whatever scraps of evidence you could find that your birth had actually happened when you said it did. People dug out the family Bible where a parent had written the birth in the margins decades earlier. They tracked down old census records that showed them as a child of a certain age. They found baptismal records from the church. They got sworn statements from the elderly midwife or doctor who had been present, if that person was even still alive, or affidavits from older relatives and neighbors who could swear they remembered the birth. The Social Security Administration to this day still spells out this hierarchy of evidence. The best proof is a birth or religious record made before you turned 5. But in its absence, a family Bible, school records, census records, insurance policies, a statement from the midwife, all of these could be marshaled to establish a life that the state had never bothered to write down. It's a remarkable inversion when you think about it. For the first time, the burden fell on the individual to prove to the government that they existed and always had, using exactly the kind of oral and communal and improvised evidence that the entire modern system had been built to replace. Then came the Second World War, and it drove the point home a second time. As America mobilized for war, defense plants and government agencies needed to verify the identity and citizenship of an enormous workforce flooding into the factories. Suddenly, Getting a job in war production could require a birth certificate too. This industrial mobilization completed the transformation. The birth certificate finished its journey from an obscure public health statistic into an essential document of everyday personal identity, the thing you needed to work, to claim benefits, to prove you were who you said you were. One quick note that trips a lot of people up, especially those researching their family history. During this whole period, the Census Bureau distributed something called a Notification of Birth Registration, a form it designed in 1924 and sent to parents to confirm their child's birth had been recorded and to let them correct any errors. Countless families kept these, and countless descendants today mistake them for birth certificates. They are not. That notification was never a legal birth certificate, and it was discontinued in the late 1940s once states were finally keeping good enough records on their own. It's a little artifact of the awkward decades when the system was still learning to walk. By the middle of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. In the span of a few decades, America had gone from a country where most people had no record of their birth and didn't need one, to a country where a birth certificate was the key that unlocked your entire relationship with the state. And once that key existed, a new and permanent problem was born. What happens to the people who don't have one? Today, your birth certificate is what document experts call a breeder document. It is the seed from which your entire documented identity grows. From your birth certificate, you get your social security number. From those two, you get your passport, your driver's license, and now your federally compliant identification. Every branch of your legal identity traces back to that one root. Pull the root and the whole tree falls, which means that in modern America, not having a birth certificate is not a minor inconvenience. It can render you effectively invisible, locked out of ordinary life. We are living through a moment when this is more visible than it has been in generations. Over the last 2 decades, the country has moved steadily toward requiring stronger and stronger proof of identity and citizenship. The Real ID Act, passed in 2005, set federal standards for identification, and after years of delays, its requirements finally began to bite in 2025, changing what you need to board a domestic flight or enter a federal building. At the same time, proposals have advanced in Congress that would require Americans to show documentary proof of citizenship, such as a passport or a birth certificate, simply to register to vote. And here's the number that should stop you cold. According to research by the Brennan Center for Justice, more than 9% of American citizens of voting age, roughly 21.3 million people, do not have proof of their citizenship readily available. And at least 3.8 million citizens don't have those documents at all because they were lost, destroyed, stolen, or never issued in the first place. These are not undocumented immigrants. These are American citizens born here who cannot easily lay their hands on the paper that proves it. And the burden falls hardest, the research shows, on the young, on lower income Americans, on people of color, and on women whose current name no longer matches the one on their birth certificate. That last point isn't abstract. Consider the true story of a man born in Arizona in the 1920s, a United States citizen, a veteran of the Army Air Corps in World War II, with a paper trail stretching across an entire long life, his discharge papers, his house deed, his children's birth certificates, his Social Security and Medicare cards, and yet, late in his life, when he applied for a federally compliant ID, he was turned away, because the name on his birth certificate, Vicente, didn't match the name he'd gone by for most of his life, Vince. A 98-year-old American war veteran, effectively rendered undocumented by a mismatch between two pieces of paper. At the other end of the spectrum are the newborns. In recent years, some undocumented immigrant parents in states like Texas found themselves unable to obtain birth certificates for their own children, children who were born on American soil and are therefore American citizens by the plain text of the 14th Amendment, because the parents couldn't produce the specific identification the local registrar demanded. Those children, citizens from birth, risk becoming effectively stateless, unable to enroll in school or access basic services, because the document that would prove their existence was being withheld from the very start. And across both borders, there are people like a woman profiled some years ago who was born in Mexico, lives in the United States, and, in her own devastating words, does not officially exist in any country. Never registered at birth in Mexico, undocumented in America. She cannot open a bank account, cannot marry, cannot get a diploma. She is a whole human being, working, living, hoping, who is invisible to every government on earth, because at the moment of her birth, nobody wrote her down. This is the strange destination we've arrived at. We built a documentary system so total, so foundational, that its greatest power is no longer just the ability to see you. It's the consequence of not being seen. For most of American history, having no birth record cost you almost nothing because nobody had one. Today, having no birth record can cost you nearly everything. So let's return to that piece of paper in your drawer. For the first century and more of this nation's existence, it did not exist. The government knew you, if it knew you at all, as a tick mark in a census column, a name on a tax list, a body in a militia muster. Your identity lived in the memory of your neighbors and the approximate testimony of your own mouth. Your age was a negotiation. Your existence was communal, oral, and gloriously undocumented. And nobody thought that was strange, because it was simply the way the world had always worked. Then, over the span of a few short decades, from the Permanent Census Bureau of 1902, through the child labor fights, through the birth registration areas, through the Social Security scramble of the 1930s, we handed the state a new and profound power, the power to be the official keeper of the record of your existence. And like almost everything in history, that transfer of power was neither purely good nor purely bad. It was both, deeply and at the same time. On one hand, being counted was a genuine gift. The documented identity that we now take for granted is what allows an ordinary person to claim the protections of the modern world. It's what pulled children out of factories and put them in schools. It's what let a worn-out laborer prove he'd reached 65 and claim the pension he'd earned. It's what lets you get a passport, cross a border, and come home again. It's what makes you legible to a system that can, at its best, protect you, educate you, and care for you. Oral communal identity could never have done any of that at the scale of a nation of hundreds of millions. But on the other hand, to be counted is to be controlled. The same system that recognizes you can classify you, and the same registrar who confirms your birth can, like Walter Plecker, decide to erase your people from the record entirely. The same document that opens every door can, if you happen not to have it, lock everyone. When you let the state become the arbiter of who is real, you are trusting not just the system, but every human being who sits at its controls. And history is unambiguous about how badly that trust can be betrayed. The question the title asked was, how did the government know you existed? And the honest answer is that for most of American history, it barely did, and it barely cared to. But sit with that question a little longer, and it turns into a much harder one, the one that actually matters. It's no longer, how did the government know you existed? It's, what does it mean that today, in a very real and practical sense, you do not fully exist without the government's word for it? That the proof of your own life is a document you did not create, that you do not control, and that a clerk you will never meet has the power to issue, to alter, or to withhold? That is the bargain at the heart of modern citizenship, and every one of us is born into it now, whether we ever think about it or not. The birth certificate is a promise, and it is a leash. It is the state saying, we see you, we know you, you are real, and it is the state reserving the right to define exactly what that reality is. We gained enormous things when we made that trade. We should never forget what we gave up, or who has been crushed in the gap between the counted and the invisible. So the next time you pull out that stained little piece of paper with the seal and the strange colored ink, take a second to really look at it. Because it is not just a record of when you were born. It is the newest and one of the most powerful chapters in the very old human story of who gets to decide that a person is real. If this story made you see that ordinary document in a completely new light, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden history behind the systems that quietly run our lives, the stuff nobody taught you in school, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. I'll see you there.